They laughed. High above the Mediterranean, under a sun so bright it burned the clouds into white flame, German ace pilots, veterans of Spain, masters of the blitzkrieg skies, watched American Wildcats claw their way upward. They saw the squat, stubby planes with their barrel bodies and clunky wings wobbling against the wind. And they laughed. One Luftwaffe pilot sneered over the radio, "Look at those barrels, slow, fat, American toys. They'll burn easy." Moments later, tracer rounds lit up the air like a violent fireworks show. But something strange happened. The American toys didn't fall. They took hits, direct hits, and kept flying. Some, belching smoke, even turned back into the fight. One Me-109 dove in to finish the job and found itself shredded by the Wildcat's .50 caliber guns. When the smoke cleared, the joke wasn't funny anymore. The Wildcat, underestimated, mocked, nearly written off as obsolete, had just survived what German engineers swore it couldn't, and struck back harder. This is the story of how one ugly duckling of the US Navy and Marine Corps turned humiliation into triumph, how pilots who started the war as underdogs became legends whose grit and ingenuity flipped the script on Axis arrogance. It's the story of the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, and the men who proved that heart, armor, and stubborn courage could turn a joke into a nightmare for the Luftwaffe and the Imperial Japanese Navy alike. So how does a plane the Germans mocked end up outlasting their most famous fighter, the Me-109? Let's go back to where it all began. Because before the laughter came the storm. It's 1939. Europe is burning. The Messerschmitt Bf 109, the pride of the Luftwaffe, is slicing through the skies over Poland, then France, and soon over the Channel. To sleek, fast, deadly. The engine hums with confidence, Germany's mechanical perfection, a flying embodiment of the Reich's obsession with superiority. To German pilots, flying the 109 felt like driving the future. It was fast, agile, and armed with cannons that could rip through any Allied plane in seconds. Then there's America, still at peace, still unsure if it'll even join this new world war. And in a quiet Long Island workshop, engineers at Grumman Aircraft are tinkering with something that looks, well, outdated. A tubby little fighter that looks more like a beer can with wings. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat. It wasn't built for beauty. It was built for survival. And in 1939, survival didn't look glamorous. The Wildcat wasn't supposed to exist. Originally, Grumman had proposed a biplane fighter, the XF-4F-1, a relic before it even left the drawing board. But by the time the prototype was ready, the world had changed. Monoplanes like the British Spitfire and German 109 had already rewritten aerial combat. So Grumman scrapped their biplane idea and built a new version, the XF-4F-2, a single-wing fighter. It still looked bulky. It still flew slower than the competition. But it could take a beating. While other designers obsessed over speed and maneuverability, Grumman focused on toughness. Thick armor plating, self-sealing fuel tanks, a landing gear so rugged it could slam onto carrier decks and live to do it again. Pilots joked that you could crash a Wildcat into a wall, dust it off, and it'd still start right up. And that wasn't far from the truth. The Wildcat could climb like a mule dragging a load uphill, but once it got up there, it could fight like hell. Still, when German intelligence first saw reports on America's new naval fighter, they dismissed it as a transitional design, a placeholder until the US caught up technologically. That arrogance would cost them. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor. The US Navy's battleships are burning. The Pacific Fleet is crippled. America's suddenly at war. And the planes that must defend it, those stocky, second-rate Wildcats, are now the front line against the most feared air force in the Pacific, the Imperial Japanese Navy, flying the agile Mitsubishi A6M0. On paper, the Wildcat shouldn't have stood a chance. The Zero could outclimb it, outturn it, outrun it. The Wildcat's top speed? Around 318 miles per hour. The Zero? Nearly 350. But on the battlefield, paper doesn't always tell the truth. At Wake Island, a tiny speck in the Pacific, a handful of Marine Corps pilots flying Wildcats faced an onslaught of Japanese bombers and fighters. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and yet they fought like cornered lions. Major Henry Hank Elrod, one of those pilots, made his stand with sheer guts. On December 11, 1941, Elrod attacked Japanese bombers head-on, taking down 2 before his guns jammed. He didn't bail out. He landed his damaged Wildcat, grabbed a rifle, and kept fighting on the ground until he was killed defending the island. His courage earned him the Medal of Honor posthumously, and the legend of the Wildcat began. By 1942, the Wildcat had become the Navy's backbone. Its pilots flew from carriers like Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, the floating airfields that would carry the fight across the Pacific. And here's where the Germans come in. As the Luftwaffe dominated Europe, German advisors shared tactics and intelligence with their Axis partners in Japan. When reports of the Wildcat's performance reached them, German analysts scoffed. Primitive, they called it. Too heavy. Too slow. No match for the 0 or the 109. But pilots in the field started noticing something odd. Japanese airmen, who had grown used to watching enemy planes explode after 1 or 2 cannon hits, were now seeing these stubby Wildcats soak up fire and keep flying. One Japanese pilot reportedly described it as, like shooting at a rock that spits fire back. The Wildcat's armor plating, especially around the cockpit and engine, was thicker than most fighters in the world. Its self-sealing fuel tanks meant that even when enemy rounds punched holes through its wings, the leaking fuel would seal up before it could ignite. German fighters, by contrast, prioritized speed. The Me-109s light construction gave it agility but little margin for damage. The result? In prolonged dogfights, Wildcats could take punishment the Germans couldn't imagine and keep returning fire. In one after-action report, a U.S. Navy pilot recalled seeing a fellow Wildcat pilot return to his carrier with 67 bullet holes in his fuselage. The plane still landed, and after a patch-up, it flew again the next day. Now, you might be wondering, how do German pilots laughing at the Wildcat fit into all this? The Wildcat's most famous battles were over the Pacific, but its legend reached Europe and North Africa through shared Axis intelligence. In 1942, as the U.S. joined the North African Campaign, British forces flying American-made Wildcats, known in the Royal Navy as the Martlet, clashed with the Luftwaffe over the desert. And that's where the German laughter began. To Luftwaffe aces like François Marseille, the Star of Africa, the Martlet looked laughable. Compared to the sleek 109F he flew, the Martlet was stubby, thick, and, in his words, an American cow with wings. But air combat has a way of humbling arrogance. In one engagement off the coast of Tunisia, Martlets from the carrier HMS Audacity encountered a flight of Me-109s. The Germans dove in confidently, assuming an easy kill. Except the Martlets didn't fall apart. Their armor absorbed the first bursts. The British pilots, trained in tight naval formation fighting, turned together, overlapping their fields of fire. Within minutes, one 109 went down, then another. The survivors broke off, stunned. Afterward, German pilots reported that the American planes are armored like tanks. That line spread fast. And by 1943, when American and German pilots met indirectly over the Mediterranean, that laughter turned uneasy. Back in the Pacific, the Wildcat was evolving, both the aircraft and its pilots. They learned to fight smarter. Since the 0 could outturn them, they stopped trying to dogfight. Instead, they developed what became known as the Thatch Weave, a deadly teamwork tactic invented by Lieutenant Commander John Jimmy Thatch. Picture this, 2 Wildcats flying side by side, weaving toward and away from each other like 2 dancers crossing paths. If a 0 tried to tail one, the other would swing in and get a perfect shot. It was teamwork weaponized. And it worked brilliantly. During the Battle of Midway, Thatch himself led a formation using this maneuver. His pilots shot down multiple 0s with minimal losses. Even captured Japanese reports admitted confusion and frustration at how the slow, American planes kept outsmarting them. The Germans had mocked American design, but the Americans were winning with tactics, not just tech. And soon, the Germans would learn firsthand that the inferior Wildcat design philosophy, durability over speed, was about to redefine air combat. By late 1943, the Luftwaffe's own Me-109s were starting to show their age. While America transitioned to the newer F-6F Hellcat and F-4U Corsair in the Pacific, the Wildcat's design spirit lived on, stronger, tougher, more survivable. German engineers began to realize they had built a high-performance race car in a demolition derby. They needed armor. They needed endurance. They needed what the Wildcat had. But by then it was too late. When American Wildcats, flown by Navy pilots off escort carriers, faced German U-boats and aircraft in the Atlantic, they showed the same stubborn survival that had made them legends in the Pacific. In one 1944 encounter, a Wildcat from USS Guadalcanal was hit multiple times by anti-aircraft fire while strafing a U-boat. The pilot, Lieutenant William South, pressed on, crippled the submarine, then somehow limped back to the carrier. His Wildcat had holes you could stick a fist through. It still made it home. By war's end, the laughter had stopped. German pilots no longer mocked the Wildcat. Some even admitted grudging respect. One Luftwaffe veteran reportedly remarked after the war, "The Americans built flying armor. We built glass knives." You can almost hear it, the deep, metallic roar of that little engine pushing its way into history. The Wildcat wasn't the fastest. It wasn't the prettiest. But it had something that the Axis never fully understood. The American pilots will to adapt, survive, and fight back. When German pilots mocked it, they underestimated more than a machine. They underestimated the spirit behind it, the farm boys, mechanics, and sons of factory workers who climbed into those cockpits and made the impossible possible. It wasn't just about horsepower or armor thickness. It was about attitude. The Wildcat was America in metal form. Tough, underestimated, unpolished, but unstoppable when cornered. And that's a lesson that echoes far beyond the war. Because every underdog, every person told they're too slow, too small, too outdated, has a bit of the Wildcat in them. But the story's only beginning. Because while the Germans laughed, another kind of war was brewing, one fought in the air, across oceans, between pilots who would meet only once, in a split second of life and death. And on a Sunday in 1943, that arrogance would meet its reckoning. Palm Sunday. The day the Wildcats came hunting. Palm Sunday, April 18, 1943. The Mediterranean sky was blinding that day, the kind of blue that felt infinite, stretching from the white-capped sea to the horizon of dust and desert. Below, convoys of Axis transports churned across the water, German and Italian reinforcements trying to reach Tunisia. The Allies had been strangling them for weeks. Supplies were scarce. The Luftwaffe had to protect these ships at all costs. To do that, they assembled a massive air convoy, dozens upon dozens of aircraft. Bombers, transports, fighters. It was supposed to be a show of force, a parade of German and Italian air power. The Allied pilots called it the Great Turkey Shoot. But before that name became legend, the Germans were confident. They didn't expect American Wildcats to be there at all. They were wrong. High above, squadrons of American and British fighters, Spitfires, Kitty Hawks, and Wildcats waited in the shimmering heat, guided by radar and code-breaking intelligence that pinpointed the Axis flight path. The Germans never knew their radios had been compromised. They were flying straight into a trap. It was Easter Sunday, and the Allies were about to give the Luftwaffe a resurrection lesson they wouldn't forget. The Wildcats that day were part of a new generation of hardened pilots, men who had learned the lessons of Wake Island and Midway, who flew not with arrogance, but with iron determination. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Robert "Bob" Dibb, a calm, deliberate pilot from Ohio who'd once worked as a mechanic before joining the Navy. He'd spent months flying escort missions across the Atlantic, hunting U-boats, watching friends disappear into smoke and sea. Now, on this blazing Sunday, his job was simple: protect the Allied bombers and tear apart anything that threatened them. Simple, but not easy. Dibb adjusted his oxygen mask, checked his gauges, and squinted through the canopy. He could see the sun glinting off the water far below. Then, dots on the horizon. At first, they looked like gnats against the sky. Then they grew, shapes resolving into wings and fuselages. Dozens. And the radio crackled. All units, bandits inbound, 20 miles. Looks like a full Luftwaffe transport group. Dib's hand tightened on the throttle. Roger that, he said quietly. Let's give them a Sunday sermon. Below them, German pilot Lieutenant Erich Keller had no idea he was flying into one of the most disastrous ambushes in Luftwaffe history. He was escorting Junkers transports, packed with troops and equipment, bound for Tunisia. His squadron leader had been boasting earlier that morning about how these clumsy Allied fighters couldn't handle desert heat, how American planes overheated and jammed too easily. Erich believed it. They had no reason to fear Wildcats. The 109s were faster, better armed, or so they thought. He looked down at the ocean and saw sunlight shimmering like silver shards. He adjusted his goggles, relaxed in his seat. The day seemed calm. And then the sky exploded. Out of nowhere, the Wildcats and Spitfires dove like hawks, sun flashing off their wings, guns blazing. Tracer fire streaked past his canopy in red-orange lines. Keller yanked his stick back hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. His formation scattered. He glimpsed a flash of blue-gray, a Wildcat screaming past his right wing. He'd never seen one this close before. It looked slow, thick, almost awkward in its roll. He sneered. But before he could tighten his turn, the Wildcat cut across and opened fire. The rounds tore through his fuselage. The canopy cracked. Smoke filled the cockpit. Keller barely made it out, his parachute opening just in time to watch his aircraft spin into the sea. Below him, the massacre continued. In less than half an hour, the Luftwaffe's air bridge over the Mediterranean collapsed in flames. Over 70 Axis aircraft were destroyed. Transport after transport spiraled down, burning, engines screaming into the water. The Wildcats, though fewer in number, tore through the formation with relentless precision. Their guns rattled in rhythmic bursts, their pilots calling out targets in clipped radio chatter. Got one, 109, braking left. Transport smoking, finish him. Stay tight, we've got more coming down from 10 o'clock. The German formation disintegrated. Pilots who had once mocked the Americans for flying armored trash cans now found those same machines clawing through their defenses. When one Wildcat took a hit, it didn't fall apart. It shrugged it off, pulled up, and kept fighting. The Luftwaffe pilots couldn't believe what they were seeing. Later, survivors would recall that the Americans seemed impossible to kill. One German crewman, rescued days later, told his interrogators, "We shot one down 3 times. It just wouldn't die." By sunset, the Mediterranean was littered with burning wreckage. Palm Sunday had become a funeral for the Luftwaffe's pride. For pilots like Bob Dib, it was vindication. He returned to base exhausted, his plane riddled with bullet holes. His hands trembled as he climbed out of the cockpit. The Wildcat's fuselage was peppered, the wings shredded at the edges. The mechanics stared in disbelief. "How'd this thing stay airborne?" one asked. Dib just patted the side of his plane and said, "She's a Grumman. She doesn't know how to quit." That line became a saying in squadrons across the Navy. She doesn't know how to quit. As word of the Palm Sunday massacre spread, the tone in German briefings shifted. Gone was the mockery. Gone were the jokes about flying barrels. In its place, respect and quiet fear. Luftwaffe command realized they had underestimated their enemy, not just in engineering, but in willpower. The Americans, once dismissed as amateurs, were now masters of adaptation. Every encounter with the Wildcat taught new lessons. The Germans learned that its armor could absorb cannon rounds that would tear their Me-109s to pieces. They learned that American pilots, working in tight formations, coordinated like clockwork. And worst of all, they learned that every time they underestimated the enemy, they bled for it. By 1943, the Wildcat had achieved something even its designers hadn't imagined. It became a symbol. In the ready rooms of carriers across the Atlantic and Pacific, young pilots gathered around metal tables, tracing bullet holes on the skin of returning aircraft. They'd run their fingers across jagged edges, amazed that the planes and the men had survived. Some would laugh in disbelief. Others would go quiet, realizing that every hole told a story, a near miss, a close call, a second chance. The Wildcat was no longer a machine. It was a companion, a lifeline, a stubborn guardian that refused to let go. At sea, the rhythm of war continued. Convoy after convoy, patrol after patrol. The Wildcats flew from tiny escort carriers, makeshift decks barely long enough for takeoff. They hunted U-boats, intercepted German bombers, and guarded Allied fleets from above. And though newer aircraft like the Hellcat and Corsair were arriving, the Wildcats kept flying. Because they worked. And because they could survive punishment that would destroy anything else. It wasn't glamorous. Wildcats didn't get the same press as Spitfires or Mustangs. But among the men who flew them, respect ran deep. One pilot, Ensign Jack McCoy, put it best in his letter home. The Wildcat's like a bulldog. Not fast, not fancy, but if it bites you, you'll feel it for the rest of your life. The Luftwaffe, reeling from Palm Sunday, began to lose control of North African skies. By May, Axis forces were collapsing. Tunisia fell. For the first time since 1939, the Germans were on the defensive. And a big part of that shift came from the air, specifically from pilots who refused to break. In one sense, it was poetic justice. The Germans had built planes for short, decisive battles. They believed speed and precision would always win. The Americans built for endurance, resilience, attrition. They fought for the long game. And the long game was exactly what World War II became. Back in Germany, engineers pored over reports of Allied aircraft performance. They noted the remarkable survivability of American planes. One analyst wrote, "Their fighters can take catastrophic damage and continue combat operations. This defies expected performance." Another added bluntly, "We may have prioritized the wrong virtues." They had. While the Me-109 evolved into sleeker, faster versions, it remained fragile. Even the smallest damage to a coolant line or fuel tank could bring it down. The Wildcat's philosophy, armor over elegance, proved superior for real war. Months later, when captured German pilots were interrogated in Allied camps, they spoke of their shock. One described an encounter where his cannon shells exploded against a Wildcat's fuselage, and the American just kept flying, shooting back. Another said, "You could feel the difference. Their machines had heart." That last line stuck. Because maybe, in some strange way, the Wildcat did have heart, an extension of the men who flew it. Pilots like Dibb, McCoy, Thatch, ordinary Americans who didn't see themselves as heroes, just men doing their job. And their job was to win. The war ground on, but the psychological tables had turned. No longer was the Luftwaffe the unchallenged master of the skies. Its aces, once symbols of invincibility, were being hunted, outsmarted, and outfought. They faced an enemy that refused to fit the stereotype, an enemy they'd mocked for building farm machines with wings. That underestimation would echo across every front. From the deserts of Tunisia to the waves of the Pacific, Axis arrogance met American resilience, and broke against it. After Palm Sunday, the Wildcats' legend was sealed. Pilots painted victory marks on their fuselages, shared whiskey in metal cups, and told stories that grew with every retelling. They joked about the Wildcat being the plane that laughed last. But beneath the jokes was pride, the quiet kind born from survival. Every pilot knew the truth. They owed their lives to that tough, stubby fighter. It might not have looked fast. It might not have looked modern. But it brought them home. And in war, that's all that matters. When the Luftwaffe crumbled in the years that followed, those same American pilots would remember the early days, the laughter, the arrogance, the doubt. And they'd remember how it felt to prove everyone wrong. Because the Wildcat wasn't just a plane. It was a lesson. That underestimation kills. That toughness beats arrogance. That sometimes the slow, stubborn fighter outlasts the sleek one. And that the heart of a nation can live inside a steel frame with wings. So when you think of the Wildcat, imagine not just the roar of its engine, but the defiance it carried into the sky. Imagine the pilots climbing into those cramped cockpits, sweat dripping, hands steady, knowing the odds were bad, and doing it anyway. Imagine the look on the faces of those who laughed as their bullets bounced off the barrel-bodied American toy that refused to die. The laughter didn't last. The Wildcat did. Dawn over the Coral Sea. A pale orange horizon. The ocean, flat, endless, and waiting. The American carrier task force cut through the waves, engines humming under decks loaded with steel and courage. Below deck, in the ready room, pilots sat in silence. No jokes this time. Just quiet faces under flickering lights. Each man knew what was coming. A showdown between belief and reality. The Japanese Navy, riding high after months of victory, was about to meet a fighter they thought they understood, but never respected. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat. Radio operator, the enemy carrier force spotted. Bearing 220. Distance, 70 miles and closing. The intercom buzzed through the ship like an electric pulse. Boots pounded metal floors. Hatches slammed open. Engines roared to life. One by one, Wildcats rolled down the deck, their heavy frames shaking against the wind. Lieutenant Commander John Thatch led the 1st Division. The same Thatch who designed a maneuver so brilliant it turned the Wildcats' weaknesses into strengths. They called it the Thatch Weave. 2 fighters crossing paths in a deadly dance, baiting, switching, covering each other's blind spots. It was born out of desperation, but it changed air combat forever. Thatch, radio. Stay tight, boys. They'll come in fast. Make 'em overshoot. Remember, if you get separated, weave back to me. His voice was calm, steady, the kind that made you believe you'd make it home. Above the sea, the Wildcats climbed, slow, deliberate, steady as bulldogs. They couldn't match the speed or agility of the Zero. But Thatch knew something the enemy didn't. Speed means nothing if you can't hit your target. Minutes later, black dots on the horizon. Dozens of Mitsubishi A6M0s slicing through the sky, sunlight glinting off their silver wings. They came in waves, fast, graceful, deadly. The Wildcats tightened formation, guns armed. But here they come. Eyes open. We fight as one. The first burst of fire came from above. Tracers streaked past. The air turned into chaos. Thatch rolled his Wildcat left, dove slightly, and called out to his wingman. But cross now. 2 Wildcats banked toward each other. The Zeros followed, too close, too confident. And then it happened. The Thatch weave snapped shut like a trap. The lead Zero overshot, and in an instant, Thatch's wingman lined up the shot. 1 burst, 1 kill. The Japanese formation faltered. For the first time, the Wildcat wasn't running, it was hunting. The radio filled with overlapping voices. Got one smoking. 2 o'clock high. Break, break. They're diving in pairs. Watch your tail. The sky was a storm of metal and fire. But something was different this time. The Wildcats weren't breaking apart. They were fighting as a unit, methodical, coordinated, brutal. Thatch's plan worked. Every time a Zero turned to strike, another Wildcat was already waiting, guns locked, wings steady. In the chaos, Lieutenant Edward Butch O'Hare emerged as the name everyone would remember. A lone Wildcat against 9 bombers. 9. The odds were impossible. The command radioed him to withdraw. He didn't. He dove straight into the formation. Machine guns rattled. He weaved between tracer lines so close they lit his cockpit in orange flashes. 1 bomber burst into flame. Then another. Then another. He moved with terrifying precision, firing short, controlled bursts, each one fatal. By the time he was done, 4 enemy bombers were falling out of the sky. He was out of ammo, his plane riddled with holes, but he made it home. When he landed, the deck crew counted 21 bullet holes. The Wildcat held together. O'Hare would receive the Medal of Honor. The Japanese commander who faced him wrote later, "That one plane changed how we viewed the Americans." In briefing rooms across the Pacific, Allied intelligence pored over combat reports. The pattern was clear. Every time the Wildcats fought as a team, they won. Every time the enemy underestimated them, they paid. The Germans had learned it in the Mediterranean. Now, the Japanese were learning it over the Pacific. And the lesson was the same: never laugh at a Grumman. The Wildcat story wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. It was slower, heavier, clunkier, but it could dive when others couldn't. It could take hits and keep flying. Its thick armor saved pilots who'd never have survived in lighter, faster planes. And in naval warfare, survival meant experience, and experience meant victory. By 1942, American pilots had lived long enough to get better. The learning curve that killed rookies in 1941 now favored them. Veterans in Wildcats were surviving longer than their enemies could replace theirs. That was the turning point. On carriers like USS Enterprise and USS Saratoga, the Wildcat became a symbol of resilience. Deck crews would joke, "If the ship sinks, grab onto a Wildcat. It'll float." But beneath the humor was reverence. Every pilot trusted that plane with his life. You could see it in the way they touched the fuselage before climbing in, a quick pat for luck. They knew what the Wildcat could do, and they knew what it had already done. By late 1942, the Wildcat ruled the skies over Guadalcanal. It fought through tropical heat, monsoon rains, and endless dogfights. The Japanese tried every tactic: dives, vertical climbs, head-on attacks. The Wildcats adapted. They learned to fight dirty, to use the sun, to bait their enemies low where they lost their speed advantage. Day after day, they clawed for every inch of air superiority. And they won it. In one of the most brutal engagements, over Henderson Field, a squadron of Wildcats defended the island from a wave of Zeros and bombers. They were outnumbered 3-1. By the end of the battle, smoke filled the horizon. The airstrip was cratered. 2 Wildcats were down. But the Japanese lost nearly 20 aircraft. When the surviving pilots landed, their planes were shredded, bullet holes through wings, cracked glass, oil leaks. But they were alive. And that's what mattered. The ground crews stood in silence as the battered planes rolled in. One mechanic whispered, "They came home again." The Wildcat wasn't immortal, but it felt like it. It taught a generation of pilots that courage wasn't about speed. It was about staying in the fight. It became the soul of early American air power, a symbol of stubborn defiance in the face of technical superiority. And as the war dragged on, even as newer models replaced it, the Wildcat's legend only grew. In Berlin and Tokyo, analysts reviewed the combat data. They couldn't understand it. How could a plane that was objectively inferior keep winning? The answer was simple. Because it wasn't about the plane anymore. It was about the men behind it. Men who refused to break. Men who turned mockery into mastery. Men who flew a plane built like a tank and made it fly like a hawk. By 1943, the Wildcat had achieved something no one predicted. It became the underdog that rewrote air combat doctrine. Every major air force began rethinking its designs. Armor mattered. Visibility mattered. Teamwork mattered more than raw performance. Even the mighty Messerschmitt and the Zero couldn't escape the lesson. Speed fades. Glory fades. But toughness endures. When the war finally turned in the Allies' favor, the Wildcat had already done its job. Newer fighters, Hellcats, Corsairs, Mustangs, would take the spotlight. But every one of them carried a little Wildcat in their DNA. The same design philosophy. The same spirit. Because the Wildcat had taught the world what really wins wars. Not perfection, but persistence. Years later, a Japanese ace who fought over Guadalcanal was interviewed. He was asked which American fighter he respected most. He didn't hesitate. "The Wildcat," he said, "because it never stopped fighting." And that's the truth. For all its flaws, for every laugh it earned from enemy pilots, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat outlasted them all. It turned ridicule into revenge. It made believers out of doubters. And it became the roar of a generation that refused to quit. When the engines died down and the decks went quiet, pilots would sit under the stars, helmets beside them, staring at their planes. They knew the war wasn't over. But for that night at least they had the sky. Because the Wildcats ruled it. Night over the Pacific. The sea, calm now, like the war had paused to take a breath. But inside the carriers, no one was sleeping. The Wildcat crews knew this quiet never lasted. The pilots, the mechanics, the radio operators, they all lived in the same rhythm of tension and exhaustion. Every day, another dogfight. Every night, another round of bullet holes to patch and names to cross off the board. And still, the Wildcat flew. every mission, every sortie, every dawn. The joke that started in German hangars and Axis briefings, that American planes are slow, clumsy toys, had died somewhere over the blue fire of the Coral Sea. The world wasn't laughing anymore. By 1943, the Wildcat had earned respect the hard way, by surviving. When you looked at its record, the numbers told a story sharper than any propaganda reel. Combat losses, far fewer than predicted. Kill ratios, climbing with every battle. Morale, unbreakable. The F-4F Wildcat had defied logic. It wasn't supposed to win, but it did, again and again, because it fought like the men who built it. Solid, gritty, determined. In Germany, Luftwaffe intelligence started paying attention. Reports filtered in from their Italian allies, descriptions of stubborn American naval fighters that refused to fall. German analysts studied the combat logs from the Mediterranean. The pilots of Jagdgeschwader 27, once so confident in their Messerschmitts, were no longer laughing either. They'd seen the Wildcat up close. They'd watched their cannon shells glance off its fuselage. They'd watched it dive into the sea, only for its pilot to bail out, wave, and get picked up by a rescue boat. That kind of resilience got under your skin. One report, found after the war, included this line: "The American Grumman machine is heavy and slow, yet its durability and the skill of its pilots make it formidable." That was German code for we underestimated them. Across the Atlantic, in American factories, the engineers at Grumman worked night and day. Their plant on Long Island became known as the Iron Works. Because every plane they built seemed indestructible. When a Wildcat came back shot to pieces, they studied it. They asked the pilots what worked and what didn't, and every flaw became fuel for evolution. Out of that process came the F-6F Hellcat, the Wildcat's meaner, faster, deadlier little brother. But here's the part few know. The Hellcat wasn't a replacement. It was a continuation, a direct descendant of the lessons learned by the F-4F. Every rivet, every gun mount, every armor plate was inspired by what the Wildcat had endured. When the Hellcat entered service, it tore through Japanese air power. Its first major test, 1943, over the Gilbert Islands, was a slaughter. The US Navy downed more than 300 enemy aircraft in a week. Most of those kills were credited to former Wildcat pilots. Same men, new plane, same spirit. By the end of the war, the Hellcat achieved a kill ratio of 19-1. But that victory was born years earlier, inside the cockpit of the Wildcat. Let's rewind, though, back to those early years when the outcome was far from certain. The world forgets how close it came. In 1942, the Axis controlled more of the world than any empire before them. Europe was under German rule. Asia bowed to the rising sun. And the Americans? They were the underdogs. Their navy was rebuilding from Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were green. Their planes, but they had heart. And they had the Wildcat. There's something poetic about that. A war machine built not for speed, not for beauty, but for survival. A plane that looked clumsy until you saw it in a fight. A symbol of the working-class hero, tough, dependable, underestimated. When the Wildcat clawed its way through the Pacific, it didn't just defend America's carriers. It defended hope. Every victory it earned, no matter how small, proved something vital. That the Allies could stand toe-to-toe with the best the Axis had to offer. That courage could outfly arrogance. Interlude, letter from a pilot. June 1942. Lieutenant Harold "Bucky" Watkins writes home from the USS Yorktown. "Mom, they say the Germans think our planes are jokes. I wish they could see how my joke took 3 zeros with it yesterday. Tell Dad, the Grumman's like his old pickup, ugly, loud, but it never quits. If I make it back, I'll owe it to that steel beast." He didn't make it back. His Wildcat did. The deck crew patched it, refueled it, and another pilot took it up the next morning. That was the Wildcat's legacy. Its pilots might fall, but the plane kept flying. After the war, when American aces met their former enemies at reunions and air shows, one topic always came up: respect. German and Japanese pilots admitted they'd misjudged American aircraft early on. The Wildcat, in particular, baffled them. How could something so heavy stay in the air? How could something so slow always seem to be in the right place at the right time? The answer, they realized, wasn't in the specs. It was in the strategy. The thatch weave, the teamwork, the discipline. It changed how aerial warfare worked. The Americans had turned science into instinct. That's the secret heartbeat of the story. The Wildcat was never about one pilot or one battle. It was about adaptation. It was America itself, scrappy, learning, taking punches, then finding a way to win. It's the story of a country underestimated by tyrants, mocked by elites, and written off as unprepared until it wasn't. The same energy that turned car mechanics into aircraft engineers, farmers into factory workers, and kids into fighter aces. You can almost hear it in the way the Wildcat's engine growls. A sound that says, "You can hit me, but you'll never stop me." By 1944, most frontline squadrons had switched to newer fighters. The Wildcats moved to escort carriers, smaller ships, slower, often overlooked. And yet, they kept winning. In one incredible engagement off the Philippines, a group of Wildcats from escort carriers defended a fleet of vulnerable transport ships against a major Japanese air assault. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and flying planes considered obsolete. But they fought like lions. In 2 hours, they shot down dozens of enemy aircraft, breaking the attack completely. When the smoke cleared, one pilot said, "The old cats still have claws." He wasn't kidding. As peace returned and the carriers docked for the last time, many Wildcats were scrapped. Their frames melted down, their engines silenced. But some were preserved, kept in museums or by collectors, or displayed proudly at naval bases. Today, when you stand next to one, it looks small, almost humble, but you can still feel the energy of it, the vibration of history, the echo of courage. It's a reminder that greatness doesn't always roar in sleek designs or record speeds. Sometimes, greatness rumbles through rough edges and stubborn hearts. There's a quote often attributed to a German ace, whispered decades later at an airshow in the US. "We laughed at the Wildcat because we didn't understand the American who flew it." That's the heart of this story. The Wildcat wasn't just a machine, it was an attitude. One forged in the hangars of Long Island, tested over Midway, proven in the Coral Sea, and immortalized in every man who climbed into that cramped cockpit with the world on his shoulders. So, what does it all mean now? 80 years later, the lesson still echoes. Don't underestimate the underdog. Don't mistake simplicity for weakness. And don't ever think toughness can't win the day. Because in every era, there's a Wildcat, a person, a nation, an idea, mocked by the powerful until it fights back. That's not just war history. That's human history. As the narrator's voice softens, imagine you're standing on that carrier deck at dusk. Salt in the air. The ocean endless. You hear the last Wildcat land, its wheels screeching against steel, its engine coughing to a stop. The pilot climbs out, oil-streaked, exhausted, alive. He looks down the line at the battered planes and the men who kept them flying. And in that moment, there's no laughter, no arrogance, no mockery. Only respect. Because the Wildcat earned it the hard way. With every round fired, every scar on its armor, every pilot who came home because of it. And as the camera would fade to black, you can almost hear the echo of that engine. A low, defiant growl from history itself. "You underestimated me once. Don't make that mistake again." It's quiet now. The ocean that once burned with tracer fire lies still. The skies where Wildcats clawed and bled are empty, blue, endless, free. But if you listen close, you can still hear it. A faint echo in the wind. The growl of a radial engine, somewhere between memory and myth. The Grumman Wildcat never died. It just changed form, becoming something larger than metal or machinery. It became a story, a symbol, a lesson that outlasts every dogfight and every forgotten runway. War has a way of erasing faces. It turns names into numbers. But the Wildcat story endures because it wasn't just about a plane, it was about the kind of people who built, flew, and trusted it. The kind of people who get laughed at and keep going. Who take the hit and come back stronger. Who turn underestimation into victory. You see, when the Germans laughed, when the Japanese mocked, when even American brass doubted, something deeper was happening. They weren't just mocking a plane. They were mocking the idea that perseverance could beat perfection. And that's what makes this story eternal. If you strip away the dates, the medals, the kill counts, what's left is something universal. The human instinct to endure. That same spirit that made a machinist in Long Island tighten one last bolt before his shift ended, knowing some kid's life depended on it. The same spirit that made a 20-year-old pilot climb back into a cockpit full of patched bullet holes, whispering a quick prayer before takeoff. The same spirit that made a commander look at a plane the enemy ridiculed and say, "We'll make it work." And make it work they did. The Wildcat flew in every corner of the world: Pacific, Atlantic, Arctic. It was the first American fighter to take off from an escort carrier, the first to sink enemy bombers, the first to hold the line when nothing else could. And every time it rose off the deck, it carried with it the heartbeat of a nation learning how to fight back. That's why the Wildcat still matters. Because its story isn't just about winning battles. It's about refusing to lose them. Decades later, pilots who flew Wildcats still talk about them like old friends. They describe the smell of oil and salt, the way the cockpit rattled during dives, the strange comfort of that thick steel cocoon. They talk about the moments that separated life and death. When the armor saved them. When a gun jam cleared at the last second. When the ocean came rushing up and they somehow pulled out of it. And almost every one of them says the same thing. "I trusted that plane." That's not sentimentality. That's respect earned through fire. If you walk into the Grumman Museum in New York today, there's a Wildcat on display. Its paint is chipped, its wings patched, its belly scarred. It doesn't shine like a modern jet. It just stands there, quiet, unassuming, proud. Visitors pass by, kids tugging on their parents' sleeves, asking, "Why is that one so small?" And the veterans smile. Because they know size never mattered. Not in 1942. Not now. In a way, the Wildcat is still teaching lessons. It's the same lesson that every generation has to relearn. Don't measure strength by appearances. Don't dismiss what you don't understand. And never underestimate someone just because they look slower, older, or less polished. Because sometimes the toughest fighter in the sky isn't the fastest one. It's the one that refuses to quit. You can trace that lesson through time. When the P-51 Mustang screamed over Berlin. When American engineers built spacecraft out of duct tape and determination. When a country faced impossible odds and chose to innovate instead of surrender. That's the Wildcat's legacy. It's not just in the planes, it's in the mindset. The same grit that turned obsolete into invincible. The same defiance that took laughter and turned it into legend. There's something hauntingly beautiful about that. Because somewhere in the archives, there's a photo, a Wildcat parked on a carrier deck at sunrise. A pilot leans against the wing, cigarette in hand, staring at the horizon. You can't see his face, just the outline against the dawn. He doesn't know how history will remember him. He doesn't know if his plane will survive another day. But he stands there anyway, ready. That's the spirit that built the modern world. That's the spirit that keeps people fighting for what's right when the odds say no. And maybe that's why, decades later, the Wildcat still flies. At air shows, in museums, in the hearts of those who understand what it meant. When the engine starts, that deep, rumbling growl shakes the air. Spectators look up. The old cat climbs into the sky again. Slow, stubborn, unstoppable. It's not just nostalgia. It's a reminder. A message across generations, across wars, across time. Never laugh at the underdog. Never doubt the will to endure. And never forget what courage sounds like when it takes flight. Because when the last Wildcat flies its final loop and lands in silence, its legacy won't fade with the sound. It'll live on, in every kid who dreams of flying, in every mechanic who refuses to give up on a broken engine, in every soldier, sailor, or citizen who decides that being underestimated is just the beginning of their story. That's the real victory. That's what no enemy could destroy. So the next time you hear someone say something, or someone isn't good enough, remember the German pilots who laughed at the Wildcat. Remember how those laughs turned to disbelief, how disbelief turned to fear, and how fear turned to respect. Because respect, like freedom, is earned, never given. And the Wildcat earned it in blood, fire, and sky. As the final line fades, imagine the narrator's voice soft, reverent. In the end, they called it the Wildcat. But maybe it was never really about a cat at all. Maybe it was about the heart of the people who built it. Fierce, proud, impossible to tame. And with that, the story ends the way it began, with a roar that refuses to die.